Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Among the Stoic Paradoxes that Cicero is discussing in that very work of the same name, this is probably the one that is the most difficult for people to accept, even people who are practicing Stoicism, because it is so uncompromising. In the Latin, it runs "aequalia esse peccata et recta facta," that it means wrong actions or literally sins are equal, and so are everything that is done rightly. So good things and bad things in the sense of actions, choices, virtues and vices, these are all equal to each other. They're either on the bad side or they're on the good side, and degrees or magnitude doesn't really matter insofar as it has to do with their goodness or badness, their wrongness and rightness. So this is quite a difficult proposition to accept. Cicero does provide some arguments for it, which we'll shortly take a look at. These are not necessarily conclusive in the sense that everybody will be persuaded by them, but let's take a look at what the arguments actually are. So he tells us that good and bad actions are measured by virtues and vices. Specifically, he begins by saying, this is in Paradox 3, transgressions are not to be measured by their results, by the event of what happens, right? But rather by the vices of the person who is engaging in them. And likewise with virtues. So this is assuming that there is, vices in the person who is doing wrong, or a vice, some sort of defect, right? And that there is a virtue in somebody who is good. And he says that it does not make a difference, a relevant difference. It doesn't mean that we can't make distinctions, but there is no relevant difference based on the importance of the situation. He says there's no maius and minus, greater and lesser. That matters here. There is a greater and lesser, but it just doesn't matter in the fact that we are doing the wrong thing. And the effects or the consequences themselves, well, they do exist, are not relevant to determining whether this is fundamentally good or bad. He provides some very interesting examples here. He says, if you capsize a ship that you are steering with a cargo of gold bullion or a cargo of chaff, it doesn't really make any difference. It makes difference in the result, right? Somebody's out a lot of money, whereas somebody just lost some chaff. But it's an equal mistake. So as far as the Stoics are concerned, the one person is just as culpable as is the other. Here's another example. Passion has made a slip in the case of a woman of no position. In this case, resentment extends to fewer persons than if it had played the wanton with some maiden who is a lady of high birth, right? So we could transpose this to the present, right? Somebody is in a relationship with somebody else, and there's not a lot of stakes in it, but they do cheat on them, right? Because they're motivated by desire. Now imagine somebody who is in a marriage with children, and there's all sorts of family connections going on, and there are political implications to this, and they decide to screw around, right? It's just as bad in either case. So there is no, well, it's just a small thing. The small things, Cicero is saying for the Stoics, matter just as much as the big things do as far as doing them wrong. But likewise, as far as doing them right as well. There is an interesting example a little bit later on where he says somebody might object whether a man murders his father or a slave. Don't you see any difference there? And Cicero says, well, here's what the fundamental difference is. Killing the slave is only doing one thing wrong. Killing your father is actually doing several different things wrong. And so it's not that the killing itself, as far as killing a person, is better or worse in one case or the other, but there's additional heaped on wrong actions. Now, coming back to this, Cicero makes a lot of this argument depend on his assertion that virtues are equal to each other, and that because of this, vices are as well. He'll make several different cases for this. One of these is really interesting. He says nobody can be more virtuous than the person who actually has virtue. So nobody can be braver than the brave person. Nobody can be more prudent than the prudent person. Nobody can be juster than the just person, and so on. So this seems to deny there being any degrees or development of virtue. It's like an off-on switch. You either have virtue or you don't have it. As a matter of fact, it even seems to go so far as to say if you don't have virtue, if you switch the switch backwards, you have vice instead, right? And he says that virtue is displayed in greater and lesser things. Greater and lesser not from the perspective of the virtue or whether the act is right or wrong, but in terms of other things. So he has the example, if we can trust somebody with $10, if we're making this contemporary, then we can trust them, with running a bank. If that's not the case, if they're going to be trustworthy in terms of $10, but not in terms of running the bank, they're not trustworthy. They do not have a virtue. Then they are actually vicious. They have a vice, for example, that of greed. So there are other cases that we can look at that are similar to this, right? And he talks about virtue in several different ways that are, I think, quite important here. He says, virtue in harmony with reason and unbroken constancy is one. Nothing can be added to it to make it virtue in a greater degree. Nothing can be taken away from it, and yet the name of virtue be left to it. If we start qualifying virtue, what we're doing is we're saying, well, it's not really virtue. You either possess virtue in its entirety, or you don't possess it, is what he's saying here. This is a very difficult proposition, I think, for many to accept. Now, he also makes the case that vices are going to be similarly equal to each other. So he says it follows that vices are also equal. Why? Because vices are correctly called deformities of the mind. Pravites, anime, right? So insofar as vices are what are, corrupted, what are perverted, what are turned aside, what are the opposite of virtue, because virtues are equal, vices are going to be equal. So there's no such thing as saying, well, I'm just a little cowardly. You're cowardly. There's no such thing as saying, well, I'm a little imprudent. You're imprudent. And likewise, this would seem to extend, from situation to situation to situation. Cicero would not say, you are imprudent with respect to gambling, but in everything else you're prudent. If you're imprudent with respect to one thing, it seems like you have to be imprudent with respect to all of them. Now, since, as he says, right actions equally derive from the virtues, this means that right actions are also similarly equal to each other, and wrong actions are similarly equal to each other. So he has a few other interesting discussions a little bit further on. He says, in the conduct of life, we ought not consider what penalty belongs to each transgression, but how much is permitted to each person. We ought to deem whatever is wrong a crime, whatever is not permitted a sin. And he says, even in the smallest things, yes. Now, why? Inasmuch as we are not able to impose regulation on things, but are able to regulate our mind. He gives an example of an actor. And here you have to think of a stage and playing, not an actor in a television show where you can do multiple takes or anything like that. If an actor screws up even a little bit, Cicero says, they've screwed up. And it doesn't matter whether they screwed up in such a way as to knock the whole set down or not. They screwed up. And that's what really matters. And they have control over that. He says, I will not listen to a poet when he transgresses in trifles. Am I to listen to a citizen when he measures off on his fingers his transgressions in the intercourse of life? If they appear smaller in size, they appear less in gravity. And Cicero says, that's a mistaken point of view. How can they appear smaller in size when every transgression caused by the dislocation of what he calls system and order translated here, what it's translating here is ratio, reason, and order, or ordine, right? Ordo. How can that make it better or worse? So the whole impact of this is that either what you're doing is wrong, and in that case, it is just as wrong as any other wrong that anybody else is doing, or it's right. And in that case, it's just as right. Now, this does leave a lot of questions open, like, well, isn't there anything in between? Or, well, how do you get from one to the other? Or, are virtues in some respect more right or good than the actions that come from them? Cicero does not address that here, but those are worth keeping in mind as you consider the starkness of this doctrine.